All right, hello everyone, and welcome. It is Thursday, February 18th, and we are at the second half of week three with a new round of topics to discuss. Our discussion this afternoon is going to be um, kind of moving over towards the technical side of how your music is actually working in the game. Where earlier on in the month, our focus was how do you get started on a project? What are some of the tools that you need to be prepared and get ready on this process? How do you figure out how much music you need and where the music might go in the game project? What style of music it might be? Just trying to explore the sound palette and figure out what the soundtrack is going to be all about. If you are going to produce it entirely in the DAW inside of your computer, or is it going to require hybrid instrumentation or live musicians, session musicians, or even large recording sessions? Getting a feel for the size and scale of the project as a whole. And earlier on in the stages of the production, you have a long list of to-dos of these are the pieces of music that need to be created. And over time, your list gets smaller and smaller, and the folder filled with approved music gets bigger and bigger, and the music is going to start moving into the game. And so we'll talk about some of the uses of your music in the game and how it is used, how the computer views it. So far in our projects, we've talked about the concepts of intro, loop, and ending. Our 2D platformer game was kind of based off of the idea where you would have variation and repetition between, or randomization between multiple different elements. You had three intros, three main loops, and three endings, and the game could kind of rearrange those and randomly play them in any sort of order to end up creating the final soundtrack that you hear. Angry Bots, which you worked on last week, was all about the transition between ambient and action. How do you move between multiple pieces of music? And then this week, with the Palace of Earnthalion game, it's vertically layering your music. And we're going to talk about this. This is going to be towards the end of our session today, where we'll talk about the difference between horizontal resequencing and vertical layering, and what do those terms mean, and how are they actually used in the game. So when working on all of these projects, you have gotten a sense of how the music needs to be created, the fact that the music is not just one linear file, it's actually broken out into multiple different elements that are rearranged in different sort of order to create the final music that you hear. So we know on our side how the music is supposed to work, but how does the computer know what file to play at what time, and how does the computer know how to go from intros to main loops to endings, or switching between ambient and action? So we'll talk about how your music starts moving from just a folder filled of WAV files to actually interacting with the game, and how the game uses the WAV files to create the final soundtrack. So those are some of the topics that we will get into. Our first topic is a discussion of the function of game music, and what actually it's doing for us in what purposes is it serving for over the course of the game. So what this ends up being is really a checklist of ideas and concepts that we can go through each time we're trying to identify new uses for the music. If we're stuck on an idea, or we need to develop something further. We need to make sure that the music is going to be working, and we don't run out of ideas towards the beginning, and we can kind of make sure that we are kind of fulfilling the overall theme and design all the way through the entire project. This is like a list of different ideas and topics that we can consider in the design of the music for the game. So what does game music do for us, and how does it help the story and the gameplay throughout the project? Well, the most basic and straightforward, and this is kind of the first and obvious one, is that music conveys emotion. What is music doing there in your game project? Well, probably the same thing it's doing in a film or in a television episode, or even a music album that has no visual reference. Music is really there to tell the player how to feel about something. Sound effects are the information, dialogue is the story, and then music tells the listener what to think about it, or sorry, how to feel about it. So it's pulling at their heartstrings, it's giving them a sense of danger, giving them a reward when they are doing well, and it's telling them how they might feel, and kind of pulling those emotions out of them. So that's the most kind of direct sense of what music is doing, and you always want to play to the emotional capacity in the game in that particular scene. The next thing that music can really do for you, in more specifically for a game, is bring you into the zone, get you in a state of mind that you are more connected to the game directly. So this is giving them, like, bringing them into the game, and losing the sense of the fact that you're just sitting on your couch watching your TV, hitting buttons, to actually interacting with the game world. So you kind of forget that the actual control of everything, and everything feels a little bit more fluid as you're playing the game, and as you're interacting with the storyline. It is the music there is there to support it and draw you farther and farther in to the game world. Some of this can be done through rhythm and repetition, where you can actually hear the pulse of the gameplay through the music. This works really well in music games when you're dancing around, or you're playing your guitar controller in Guitar Hero or Rock Band, and you are drawn away from the fact that you're just hitting buttons into the gameplay itself, because it's so directly connected with the music. So you want to make sure that you are pulling them into the game, and not kind of if you start annoying the player with too much musical repetition, not just directly affecting the gameplay, but just hearing the same sounds over and over again, you can break that sort of connection to the game, because it starts sounding less realistic overall. Music as a world builder. Music can create a sense of the world around you, and kind of build an environment, a sense of place, much quicker than either exploration around the game world or even the visuals. I don't know if you've seen, there was a presentation recently for the Microsoft HoloLens, which is what this is. Yes, Edward, is that the Minecraft 3D demo? Absolutely. They took Minecraft, and they have the HoloLens is this thing that the guy's wearing on his head, and it's augmented reality. It's not VR or virtual reality. Basically, they are projecting this image on the physical world, as opposed to having you totally only seeing the virtual world. And so what they did on this table is project the image. Now, if you aren't wearing one of those goggles, you can't see anything, and the camera has one of these goggles on, so it sees everything that they see. But it's a very interesting demo overall. If you haven't checked it out, go look up the Microsoft HoloLens. And but music can do you can do this and fool the ears much easier than you can fool the eyes. And we've been doing this, giving a sense of place and location for a very long time. That's what most music and sound effects is to kind of put you in a sense of place. So you can often tell the player where they are in the world by culturally relevant music and instrumentation, or when they are in history or in time for much of the same thing, or in the future, and give a sense of that through the sound and the audio and music in a much quicker time period than just doing it through visuals. Music as a pace setter. Very, very popular and easy, kind of a low-hanging fruit in racing games, where it's all about setting the pace and making the player feel like they're actually going at 160 miles an hour when they're just sitting still in their chair. And music can do this very easily through tempo and BPM and changes and making things feel like they're pulling faster or slower. And music and sound is a quick place for people to use this technique. It's a real obvious one when you're combining visuals and gameplay and audio together, and you want to get a sense of things speeding up and slowing down. Then audio is a real easy one to go with. So that can either be through changing the tempo of something, like if you get a power up. In Super Mario Brothers, the infinite life star that speeds up and goes da 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 da. That's a very common example where you all of a sudden the pace of the game doubles and you kind of feel like you need to take off running as fast as you can. Also, if you have 200 minutes left, or sorry, 200 seconds left overall, then the music speeds up also. So very commonly used in music and sound effects to kind of pull off that effect. Or else there's the Matrix everything slows down and you can bullet time and you can dodge bullets and things like that happens so commonly in games. If you need to slow down time, audio it does that with a huge pitch shift or pitch ramp. So music can really give a sense of setting the pace. Music as an audience. Music and sound effects are often there to tell the player if they are doing something good or bad. If you're doing it correct, or if you are winning, or you just got a power-up, or a high score, or you solved a puzzle, or you might hear something positive, and a series of notes that kind of go in an upward direction. To give the sense kind of a little audio reward that they did something good. And the same thing goes for negative. If you lost a life, or you lost some points, or you did something incorrect or bad, then you'll have basically the opposite effect. And the music and sound effects can do this. Very, very common in puzzle games, where you are basically constantly rewarding the player, or giving a negative effect overall through the sound effects. Music as branding. As all of these go by, you could probably hear the different musical themes, and this is even separate from the original games. The music becomes part of it, whether it's directly through marketing or advertising, or whether it is just through nostalgia and pop culture. A lot of this, why these old 8-bit games become so memorable, is because you hear them over and over and over again. And that's kind of a positive and negative thing of a larger, more complex game, where you have much longer and bigger soundtracks that you don't get that repetition so directly, which is also a good thing because you don't annoy the player and you have much more developing and complete soundtracks. But have you want to your intention of writing music often is having some element of it be so catchy and so memorable that it becomes identifiable even separate from the project, and the game reminds the player of the music and the music reminds the player of the game, and kind of goes back and forth and back and forth. Here in the chat, Jason Miller, music as an audience is heavily used in Heroes of the Storm, a Blizzard game. Sometimes the music mocks you. Absolutely. You can't do it directly, but you can easily do it through the music, and if the player actually pays close enough attention, they're like, wait a second, that wasn't... you don't want to tick the player off so much that you force them to quit the game and never turn back on again, but they always have a lot of fun with that. Next one here, music as demarcation. Demarcation is setting up different areas in the game world, having very well-defined parts of the game. Earlier games were based off of individual screens and like levels. So you went from screen to screen as you progressed through the game, and each one of them were different areas. Or now even more modern games, you can go inside of the shop, or you can go inside of the local tavern, or you go inside of the castle, or an outside, and have different physical areas in the game. And this can be highlighted through the music that you only hear in those areas. This extends to the idea of diegetic versus non-diegetic music. Diegetic music, this is a term that's based from film also, where diegetic music exists in the game world, meaning that the character in the game hears the music. There's speakers somewhere and they're hearing music, or they're in the car hearing the music. It's not just the game soundtrack that is only there for the player, for the human listening to the game. That is non-diegetic music. Most music for a game and most of the music in a film soundtrack is non-diegetic music. It doesn't exist in the actual character's world. It doesn't exist in the film world or the game world. It's just there often to elicit an emotional reaction from the player or the watcher or the viewer or whoever it is. So music can exist in different spaces, right? Whether it exists in the game world, where the player moves in and out of a nightclub. Grand Theft Auto does this very well. A lot of the music is actually diegetic in the game, in the Rockstar Grand Theft Auto game world, where to make it even seem like more realistic, you don't hear music unless you're in a place where you hear music, or it's a cutscene. And then it becomes more of a movie kind of idea, and it becomes non-diegetic, and you hear it just for the sense of emotion. So games have used this idea in pretty heavily throughout the years to really give a sense of space and location. Like, oh, I hear this music only in this area, and so I know where I am when I hear that particular piece of audio. Music creates immersion. This is giving the player a sense of kind of losing the world around them. Music does this, and sound does this very well. You can put on headphones, or you have your 5.1 surround system, and you really get a strong sense of immersion and loss from the outside world. And so they even go even further with 3D audio that feels like it can move behind you and around you in 360 degrees, gets closer and farther away, and you can, like I said, easily trick the ears more so than the eyes. So we're still getting the hang of it. Oculus Rift is kind of a cool, popular thing, and VR is really becoming more and more popular overall. But you still have to wear these big old boxes on your head, which I guess isn't all that different than wearing big old boxes on your ears as earphones. But those have, over time, I guess, gotten a little bit. Now we have earbuds that pipe them directly into your ears, and who knows where they will go with all of the visual parts of all of that. But music and sound can lose you and immerse you in the game world very, very quickly. But repetition often, not musical repetition we're very comfortable with, but audio and sound repetition gets kind of loses the suspension of disbelief, where you lose a sense. If things get too repetitive, nothing in the physical world with sound is exactly the same way every single time, unless it is a computer or some sort of mechanical sound. Anything in the natural world makes a sound. There's a slight difference in pitch and volume and filter each time. So if you have repetitive footsteps or repetitive dialogue lines or punches or kicks or jump sounds or whatever it is, gunshots, it becomes too mechanical, too robotic sounding, and you lose that sense of immersion. Like, oh, I heard that before. It sounds doesn't sound that realistic. But so everybody's working on different ways to really work on the reality and the realistic nature of the sound that you hear. Here in the chat, Edward, aren't they even working on Z-axis now so you can hear things above you? Yes. With filtering, you can, and HRTF, localization and spatialization. The thing with VR is that with just headphones, your ears are on one plane, X and Y, and they don't move up and down. But when you do VR, you can do things like this, where you twist your head, and all of a sudden now your ears are on the Z-axis and going up and down versus side to side. And so how does the audio react to that? In stereo, it's very difficult to give a sense of a height or the sense of up and down. But through different algorithms, they've developed some actual DSP that allows some of that. And that's a bit more attached to VR, where you know when the person's doing this and making their head go on all sorts of crazy directions. They have these little boxes attached to these things that are tracking the location of where your head is going, and so that also translates to where your eyes and ears are going. Let's see here. So the next topic that I want to throw out here is limited resources. Okay, is some of the limitations that we will run into when developing music for games, and some of the realities, especially when we're talking about mobile gaming. When you're working on a console game these days, or you're working on a PC and Mac game, your computers are quite powerful. So there is less of a restriction on what you're capable of doing. But even then, when you're making music and you're writing a 5-minute long song, you can easily have a DAW session that goes a couple of gigabytes big, and it has 50 or 60 or 100 tracks deep in it, and there's lots of plugins, and lots of processing power, and you can have a session that's uses a lot of resources, both hard drive space. It's a big file with lots of high resolution 24-bit 96 recordings. You can have it takes up a lot of RAM because you're using a lot of samplers and sample libraries and Contact. It uses a lot of processing power to just render and play everything. So you can even then you can still push the computer, and you can't load up an unlimited amount of Contact libraries and an unlimited amount of Space Designer plugins. But when dealing with games where you're not only playing audio, but you're playing and rendering all the graphics all at the same time, you're constantly fighting over processing power, how much RAM is available, and how much space is available on a game disk or a download. And then when you move that over into the mobile space, where the technology, it's getting better and better all of the time and quicker and quicker, but we're somewhere between 5 to 10 years back in desktop computing power if you're making a game for a mobile device. So we're going to talk about some of the limited resources that you run into and some of the things that you have to consider when working on your music for the game. Hold on just a second. Let me take a quick pause. All right, so the first one here is going to be limited RAM. The amount of RAM you have in your computer is correlates to the amount of stuff that you can play and use simultaneously, whether it's applications loaded at the same time or plugins loaded up at the same time, or how many Contact sample libraries. That's probably the main thing that you would use that could really eat up the amount of RAM that you have. But these days you might have 16 gigabytes of RAM in your computer, or 8 or 4 gigabytes worth of RAM. And that's quite a bit and can have a lot of stuff loaded up simultaneously. But when you get into orchestral libraries and some of these larger Contact libraries, they eat up the amount of RAM very, very quickly. So the amount of RAM, or having a sound loaded up into RAM, means that you can access it and play it and trigger it immediately. When you load up a large piano library into Contact, it loads up all of the different samples, and when you hit a key, it needs to be able to play that instrument immediately. So, I hope I don't lose my internet connection here, which I just did. All right, let me try this again. So, where I was when talking about RAM is that when you load up your Contact libraries, we said that the Contact libraries are often what can eat up a lot of RAM very quickly. It is loading up samples to be able to play them and trigger them immediately. So as soon as you hit a key on your keyboard, you need to hear that sound. The same thing goes for a game. As soon as you hit that trigger, hit that button, you need to hear that jump sound or that punch sound or the gunshot or whatever it is. And so that sound needs to be loaded in RAM so that it's very little latency when you trigger the sound to play between then and when you actually hear it. A lot of music is not directly stored in RAM. It is streamed off of the disk because a lot of times music, it doesn't matter if it comes either in 10 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds or 500 milliseconds. Typically less than a second It is all it takes to be able to load it up and stream it off of the disk. And so if it doesn't need to be perfectly in sync, then, which a lot of music doesn't, then it will play streaming from the disk. Even if it does need to play perfect in sync, they will load up just a little bit of it into RAM right at the beginning, about a second or two of the music into RAM, and play it and trigger it immediately, and then stream the rest of it off of the disk. So the amount of RAM that you have available to load up all of the sounds is known as your memory footprint. It is how much can I load up at any one time. Whenever you start a new level in a game, or you turn it on for the first time, often you see a loading screen. Games have gotten a lot better at this recently, in where they're just constantly loading and unloading in the background. But a lot of games based off of level spend a moment to load up. And what it's doing is it's loading everything out of RAM that's old, and all of the new stuff for that level, it's loading into RAM. So some of the original Sega Genesis had 32 kilobytes worth of RAM available for sounds. The first PlayStation had 512 kilobytes, or a half a megabyte, for all of the sounds loaded up at any one time. Then by the PlayStation 2, they went to 2 megabytes, which was a lot of space. Then by the PlayStation 3, they went to 512 megabytes, which is a huge jump. But they went to basically a half a gigabyte, to now you have 8 gigabytes worth of RAM in the PlayStation 4. So you just have an exponentially large amount of RAM. Of course, that's not just for audio. It's for graphics and everything. So the amount of RAM is how much stuff you can load up. Well, will dictate how much stuff you can load up at any one time. The disk space. One of the problems with our audio it is one of the biggest, fattest files on the game disk, especially music, which is just a long file that just takes up a whole bunch of space in one shot. So at 16-bit 44.1, a 1 minute of mono music takes up 5 megabytes, which is a lot of room on a game disk. If you start having hours worth of stereo music, or then even 5.1, it can take up a huge amount of space. And so just raw WAV files are not necessarily the best way of going, especially with music. And so there's all sorts of other formats. There's MP3 and OGG files, or OGG Vorbis files. There's core audio files if it's an Apple device. There's something called XMA if it is on an Xbox device. Both Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony each have their own proprietary formatting of their files to be able to reduce the overall file size as much as possible. So one example is when they finished the Halo 3 game, all of the audio for Halo 3 occupied 9 gigabytes worth of space. That's all of the dialogue, all of the music, and all of the sound effects. Well, the game is an Xbox game. The DVDs only store 4.9 gigabytes worth of space. So just the audio for the game, not the actual game itself, was twice as big as the entire disc was supposed to be. So they had no room for anything. They didn't even have room for all of the audio. So they took all of the audio and ran it through Xbox has their own tools to create these XMA audio files, and they have a compression ratio of anywhere up to 20:1. And this is not audio compression, this is file size compression, reducing the overall file size. And it's a lossy format, so there is some quality reduction. And so not to go all the way up, they went to halfway, and they did a 10:1 compression ratio on all of their audio for the game. And so that took 9 gigabytes of audio down to basically like 1 gigabyte of audio, and left 3 gigabytes for the rest of the game. So they were able to fit all of the audio onto the game disc along with, of course, the actual game, the rest of the content. So back in way long time ago, um, cartridges were only a couple of 100 kilobytes big, and there were thoughts of why would we ever need anything more than that? Well, of course, CD-ROMs came along with 650 megabytes worth of space. DVDs are at 4.9 gigabytes. Blu-rays now, which are probably the most common format, are 50 or can be 50 gigabytes worth of space. And even then, we just take over all of that room, and just the games get bigger and bigger and more complex. Now we have lots of downloadable games, which can even be even larger than that. And so it's just how fast is the format, and how fast can we actually get access to all of that storage. And then, not directly in the computer, but still a limitation, is your limited audio system. You're not always sure that, and when actually you can be pretty sure it's not, that your music is probably going to be heard at its best, highest quality in your studio. And beyond that, it's going to be in some more limited audio playback, whether it's somebody's cheap computer speakers that they got default with the computer, or headphones, or you would hope that everybody has some wonderful 5.1 surround sound system, home theater system hooked up to their PlayStation or their Xbox, but that's certainly not the case. Maybe they're just listening out of the mono speaker on their computer, or earbuds, or whatever it is. So there is certainly limited playback of your music and the sound effects, and you can almost guarantee it. So you should be mixing with that in mind, meaning that you listen to your music on all sorts of different formats. Don't just trust your higher quality studio speakers. Listen to it on bad speakers in your car through earbuds. Maybe if you're doing a mobile game, you don't put just tons of bass in your audio mix, because you know that it's just going to rattle the speakers in the output and sound bad of the device, or the earbuds won't be able to recreate it. So you also have to be able to create multiple different mixes, and the computer and the game can do this in real time, where you can switch between mono and stereo and 5.1 real time in the game. If you go, a lot of console games can do this, and so you have to understand that your music can shift according to whatever the player has set up. So all of these are just considerations for your music and how it is actually going to be enjoyed by the listening audience. The reality of limited RAM, limited hard drive space, limited processing power, and then limited speakers are all realities that we need to deal with in music for games. All right, the next topic here is getting into how the music is actually functioning in the game. We're going to talk about linear loops. We're going to talk about game states and how they affect our music. And then we will wrap it up with a discussion of horizontal resequencing and vertical layering. We'll define those terms and talk about how they actually affect our music. So hold on just a second. We'll do another quick pause. All right. So, um, as um, as I have said before, as the music composer, you are not the person who is typically actually putting the music into the game. And so, when you finish and complete a piece of music, then you deliver it to the client as a agreed upon or specified format for your WAV files. And then they put those files in a folder and tell the game or the code to go look for those files and play them at a particular time in a specific way. So some of these things that we're going to get into is how does the game use your music? How does the game know how to play the correct piece of music at the correct time with the correct other pieces of music? How does it tie it all together and start using the music? So what does it actually do with your WAV files? And we'll start here with the most the kind of the introductory format and the basic form of what the game is doing, and that is a linear loop. And even looping is one step more complex than just playing the file. At its most basic form, the game can be told to look in this folder, find a WAV file named exactly linear loop.wav, and play it. And it takes all the ones and zeros and spits them out of your computer in a format that you can hear, in the analog format that you can hear through your speakers. And it plays, and it gets to the end of it and stops. So that is at its most basic form. And so we don't want the music to necessarily stop all the time. And so the way that we have determined and the files that we are working with, if they need to extend for a unspecified amount of time, the way we've gone about this is through looping files. We have learned that looping music is very useful in a game because you have less of an idea what the player is going to do and how long it's going to take for them to complete an action. So if you don't know how long it's going to take them to finish the puzzle or solve the puzzle or get to a particular location or basically complete the task that they need to, then looping music is going to be your best tool to kind of sit in one place musically before you move on and transition into the next thing. So it's important to understand that the loops that we create for our projects are really quite short. And some of that goes to the fact that our gaming experiences are pretty short overall. These are not full games with large open levels or worlds that are meant for longer periods of gameplay. Even our shorter platformer game, you go in there 2D and play 2D platformer for 5 minutes and you're like, okay, I got the idea and I know what happens. There's really no end or point to the game other than getting a higher and higher score. So since the gaming experiences are relatively short, and what we really want to do is focus on switching and changing between different pieces of music to understand how the game is using those files, our loops are really quite short overall. So in a larger game experience, loops that are at least a minute long are much more common, and in fact can be many minutes long, so as not to, again, annoy the player or make them realize that they're stuck or lost in a loop. So with a loop that's 2 or 3 minutes long, you have a lot more opportunity to explore different places and go to different keys or different tempos or time signatures and return back so that everything can loop seamlessly. But the main purpose with the loop is that once you reach the end of it, it seamlessly starts back over again, and you want to do this as invisibly as possible so that the player never really realizes that the music has started over yet again. So linear loops are really helpful in something where you have levels or puzzles or often exploration, where you're just kind of wandering around trying to find the next course of action. And games are have been known to use a board switch, which is a term for, well, if the music is about to get boring because we have looped it 3 times already and we're about to hit the 4th, well, maybe we just fade the music out. It just switches off and goes away for a little while until we find the next thing that we need, and it'll fade back in. So we want to watch out for annoying the player. We want to watch out for causing or grabbing attention, causing somebody to notice what's going on in the music. There's a really good metaphor description from your textbook that describes a loop as walking around a circular path, maybe walking around a lake or something like that. Where you don't want to kind of feel like the time goes by better. You don't want to realize that you're walking around in a short loop over and over again. So not having any sort of visual cues like seeing the same tree or hearing the same bird tweet every single time. So you want to keep that same sort of idea for creating musical loops. You don't want to have anything that really grabs the attention or really draws attention to itself in your musical loop. So there's a couple of different ways and techniques to think about when creating loops. You can hide your loop points in lots of different ways. And probably the best way, of course, would be directly with the composition. If you are composing with the intention that this is going to be a musical loop, well, then the resulting loop will probably be even better overall, where you are resolving back. You know that you need to complete the musical thought within the 2-minute long loop. You need to, if you go off in any sort of direction going into a new key or a new tempo, then you probably need to return back to that same place so that it doesn't move in a new direction and then always jump back to where it was and then move off somewhere and jump back to where it was. You need it to go kind of in a bell sort of shape, where you go one where and then you come back and then you loop and then you go somewhere and you come back, and you make sure that in the composition that the end ties back in nicely with the first bar. This can be done through your choice of instrumentation. Things that have long sustains, maybe also with lower instrumentation in the lower registers. So things like choirs and basses are a bit hard, and pads, big droney pads, are a bit harder to loop because they have a lot of energy in them, and they have a very constant tone that can be really obvious when it loops around and starts over again. So if you have a string section that has a slow attack that kind of fades in over time, then it sustains all the way through, and then it stops, and then it repeats, and it fades in and stops and loops and feeds in over and over each time, you can draw attention to say, oh, hey, I hear the loop. I hear where the instrumentation is getting cut off and starting up again every single time at the beginning. You can hide loops in fades, meaning that if you build the energy up, build the instrumentation up, you should probably fade it back down to less action or less instrumentation, and have something to tie the two edges together. You don't want to fade entirely to silence, but you can use swells and fades in and out to kind of help your overall loop. Hiding loops in the downbeat of a rhythm works really well. Hiding loops in drums, like having a strong drum loop with a really set rhythm, makes for looping music a bit easier. So that certainly trying to make a loop off of the downbeat becomes much harder overall, because you have a very continuous rhythm that you need to maintain. But if you continue it, it becomes a lot easier to hide everything. You can hide loops in effects, meaning that you can blast into a whole bunch of reverb or some big long sustain sound, or have it bouncing in a delay, or basically go off into, instead of using the direct rhythm, kind of fading into weird ambient effects. And it's kind of like a DJ will do this pretty readily, where they have one record at a really strong one tempo, and then they have another one that's at a different tempo, and it's not too easy to directly beat match together. They'll just hit into a whole bunch of weird effects and sounds and stuff, where they can kind of hide it in some generic weirdness before it kind of comes back around and you transition to the next thing. So using effects, it could be direct, like effects processing, or kind of musical sound design, sort of atonal or aleatoric kind of stuff that gets you from one place to the next. The last one, editing. This is what our first assignment, the production technique from week 1, was all about. Was different techniques of creating loops, whether it is just directly topping and tailing the loop, whether it is doubling the amount of, doubling the MIDI regions and then bouncing twice as much and chopping off the first half and only leaving the second half. That's a common technique to make more seamless loops. Or we also talked about chopping a file in half and flipping the two sides and looping it that way with a big crossfade in the middle. Just different editing techniques, because a lot of time music isn't written with its loop or its specific place in the game in mind, like how long it's going to be and where is it going to fit and how is it going to loop, maybe wasn't considered in the original composition. So having to take pre-recorded material and conform it and edit it into place may take some editing trickery overall. So things to consider, and very common approaches to really create a seamless loop. Hold on a sec. All right, the next common technique, or common use, is stingers and one-shots. This is a one-shot would kind of be the opposite of a loop, meaning that it doesn't loop. It only plays through once. And a stinger is typically more specific one-shot. All stingers are one-shots, but not all one-shots are stingers. A one-shot is just a generic term that says any file that plays one time, as opposed to loop. A stinger is a little bit more specific in that it often is there to provide emphasis or embellish an idea, or emphasize something that you did right or wrong. Hey, you found the secret door. Here's a sound. Hey, you opened a treasure chest. Here's a particular sound that you hear all the time. You solved the puzzle, or you found the secret, or you found the power-up, or you got a new score or something like that. Then you would hear a particular stinger. Sometimes those stingers are directly related to the music, meaning that they are in key and they make sense within the context of the music, or maybe they're just kind of like a wild off one-off sound that is played exactly when needed in the game. So they're typically pretty short, just a couple of seconds, and they're meant to draw attention to something. They can either be musical or sound design. Like I said, they could be directly related to the soundtrack, or they could just be more of a sound effect. They're also often used to hide musical transitions. This is how we are using stingers for our Angry Bots composition. Whenever you go into one of the action cues, it plays a stinger right along with that first action when the action first is triggered. And it does this to kind of hide the sharp transition from ambient into action. Because it can be a real hard cut, you want something there to kind of hide or mask that transition. And since there is only one action cue, and you hear the same one over and over again whenever you encounter a spider bot or the mech robot or whatever it is, to present a little bit of randomization, it randomly chooses a stinger. So whether it's there to provide emphasis to something, or whether it's there to hide a musical transition or some sound, stingers are really common in games. Edward, I can hear the stinger whenever you find something in Legend of Zelda playing in my head over and over again. Exactly. It's that is a good example and a very common example of when you find something. There's a very specific set of notes, and it's often intentionally the same sound over and over again, so that you get very connected to it, and you say, yeah, I mean, it's just as good as the little animation when he raises it up and says, hey, you found something. And you hear that sound, you know you've done the correct thing. I am playing the recent game Tomb Raider past couple of days, and they have musical stingers all the way through it, where I have gone into the audio menu and you can turn down sound effects and dialogue and just play with the music. And most of the music is just ambient tones and just kind of ambient musical instruments and kind of sound designy musical instrument stuff. And anytime you go into a new area or you kind of drop down in a certain place, they'll have this hard stinger that hits, that stops the previous one and plays into the new piece of sound, so that it provides a little bit of impact, provides a little bit of sound effect, and helps to hide those transitions in the game. Puzzles, power-ups, secrets, environments, these are all common places that you'll hear stinger kind of sounds. The Tomb Raider game is really great. The most recent one, you can get it for pretty cheap these days. And I found it's a Mac game too. That's where I'm playing it. I'm playing it on my Mac computer. You can get it through Steam, and it's really well done. Jason Graves did all of the music for it, and there's a behind-the-scenes video of the music for Tomb Raider on YouTube you can check out. And they build a specific instrument for all of the weird tones that they want for the game. It's pretty cool. All right, the next idea here is game states. And game states are what we use to transition our music from one piece of music to the next. When working with music for a game, it is your focus often is switching from one piece of music to the next, not so much during the while the music is playing, meaning that the challenge for music for a game in something that's different than other formats is how do we smoothly move from one piece of music to the next, because it's separated out into a whole bunch of little different files so that we can rearrange them in all sorts of different ways. So if we need to be able to rearrange them into kind of almost random orders and configurations, then how do we tell the computer that? How does the computer know when to switch and when to change the music? So while the music is playing, the computer really isn't doing all that much, because the WAV file is just playing back, and the actual content of that WAV file, the real music, is was done by a human in a DAW before. It's not like the game is actually rendering or creating the music in real time. So while the file is playing, the computer isn't doing all that much, but it's the switching back and forth between multiple different audio files that takes a lot more interaction with the computer. So how does the computer know which file to play and at what time? And the answer to that is a game state. And I have a very bad, poor definition of game states, in that my English teacher always told me that you do not use the word that you're trying to define in the actual definition. So I totally broke that idea. And a game state is the state the game is in. It is what is the game doing at any one time while the game is being played. Like, what is happening millisecond to millisecond as the game progresses over time. And is any of that action of what's going on something that I can hook my music to kind of tell when to switch music back and forth between different files. So game states are what we associate our music with to switch it and transition. So the way games work in a kind of a fundamental nature is that they are based off of the frame rate of how fast the game is playing. Meaning, if you've ever played a powerful game on a slow computer, then you know that the game can kind of get jittery or kind of stutter. Like, it'll stutter and it'll drop frames, and the animations are not as smooth, and it can kind of feel slow overall. So you typically need a powerful computer and a fast video card to run really powerful new games. That's one advantage of having a PlayStation or an Xbox, is that the games are kind of built directly for those devices, and they know that they can maintain the frame rate. And so the frame rate of television, which is kind of the most commonly used format, is 30 frames per second. The frame rate for film is 24 frames per second. And that's kind of where we get the word frame rate, because on a analog strip of film, there were individual frames that were individual pictures of the action that, when played at a particular rate, a frame rate, fast enough, it would look like smooth motion. So games are somewhere between 30 frames per second, which is common for smooth motion on a screen, or up to 60 frames per second, which, like the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox 360, can play games at that faster frame rate overall. All right, so frame rate is how quick or smooth the game is playing. What happens is it draws the image on the screen, and then between the frames, it calculates everything that's going on. So the game runs anywhere between, a frame is anywhere between 1/30th of a second to 1/60th of a second, right? That's only like a couple of milliseconds, let's say 33 milliseconds for 1/30th of a frame. That is 33 milliseconds of time that it determines where, okay, did you did you hit the button to jump? Yes, you jumped. Okay, did you make the jump? Did you land the jump? Did you you pulled out your gun, you reloaded, and you shot at the enemy? Did you hit the enemy? Did it take off health points? All of these things in the game, the actual gameplay, is being determined at 30 times per second or 60 times per second, somewhere in that range. And the music goes right along with this. So let's take the 2D platformer, for example. It goes from intro to main loop to ending. Well, the game knows that when the game starts, it plays intro. And then it's constantly asking itself a question. It's saying, okay, has the intro file ended? And at 30 times per second, the game says, no, it hasn't ended. No, it hasn't ended. And then a couple of seconds later, it says, oh, wait, intro file has stopped playing. Then the computer says, okay, good. Now switch over to main loops. And I'm going to randomly choose main loop 2. All right, then the game keeps playing. It says, has main loop 2 ended? No. Has main loop 2 ended? No. And at 30 times per second, and to ask that question until it finally ends. And then says, has the main loop file ended? Yes. Okay, well, I'm going to randomly choose another one now. And then it keeps asking the same question over and over again. And the game state is moving at 30 times per second and constantly telling the game what's going on. The game will ask, have I lost all the health points? When you lose health in the game, eventually it goes to 0 and you die and you fall off the game level. And the music switches to your ending files, one of your 3 ending cues. So the game constantly, 30 times per second, is asking whether you have lost all your health points. When it does, it says, okay, health points are at 0. Trigger this animation for the player to fall off the game world, and then stop playing main loop, play ending file. And so game states are the hooks or the triggers that the music system uses to know how to switch between multiple different files. It's basically constantly asking the same question over and over again and constantly getting a no answer until many seconds later, and the game finally answers yes. Now switch from this piece of music to the next. And so it immediately transitions over to the next piece of music. So a game state is what's happening at any one point in time that we can use to trigger our music to change. Things like score and health and time are really common approaches for game states, right? If you get a new score, if you get each time the score ticks up, once you hit a predetermined level, then now you have the high score. Well, we're going to play high score music. Or if you get health below 10%, well, then that triggers the health music to change. Or if your time runs down to 0 and you've run out of time, then that tells the game to switch from one thing to the next. So the game is constantly keeping tabs on all sorts of pieces of information. And then the game also is determining when that basically goes from true to false or false to true and says, oh, you've run out of time. Well, now I'm going to switch to the correct piece of music as was determined ahead of time. So game states aren't really, they're more of a concept more than anything. They aren't anything physical as much as anything can be physical in a game. But they're more of an idea where you say, hey, if X happens, then let's play xmusic.wave. And then when Y happens, we're going to play ymusic.wave. And if Z happens, then we'll play zmusic.wave. And the programmer goes into the computer and says, well, if X happens, then play xmusic.wave. And you go off and you write a piece of music that's called xmusic.wave. And the game states are the triggers that are basically saying, yes, this thing has happened, then play this piece of music. And we are using game states all the time. Intro, main, loop, and ending are 3 different game states. Ambient and action are 2 different game states. It's a state is I am in the state of winning, or I am in the state of losing, or I am in the state of ambient, or in the state of action. And it's the switching in and out of those game states that transitions or switches the music from one thing to the next. So our last topic here is 2 approaches to how your music might be using all of the different game states and taking your different WAV files and using them in different ways to create what is actually being heard in the final gameplay. All of the games that we use this month, all 3 games that you've been working on so far, use these different approaches. Our 2D platformer and Angry Bots compositions are more horizontal approaches to the playback of music, and we'll explain what that means. And our 3rd game, Palace of Renthalion, has a more vertical approach in the playback of the music. So I don't think I have Logic open here. Let me open Logic real quick. So horizontal resequencing and vertical layering are 2 kind of bigger terms of something that has been done in games for a very long time, and it's only more recently that people have been writing books and teaching classes on it that they've actually come up with more prescribed terms for ideas that have been around for quite a while. So to start out with is just a kind of a visualization of what I mean when I talk about horizontal resequencing and vertical layering. And actually, really the main words to focus on is horizontal and vertical. And I will use ideas of, you'll hear me interchange the second idea. You'll hear me say horizontal and vertical orchestration, or horizontal and vertical music system, or horizontal and vertical musical approach, or it's really the general idea of how your music is laid out in the game. So when I say horizontal music system, or just the term horizontal, and talking about the music for games, I am talking visualize a single stereo track in your DAW. And on this track, you can have multiple different cues or multiple different regions. Let's do this. All right. Let's say I have those. And whenever you have multiple regions on a track, you only hear one of them at a time. Let's see. All right, so you have multiple regions on a track. When you play in your DAW, it plays through one of those regions, and you only hear one of them at a time. If you're playing and this is the only thing that you're playing, then all of the instrumentation, the entire stereo mix, needs to be in each one of these regions. And you can think about this as maybe intros, main loops, endings, and power-ups, or whatever the different categories might be. And in your DAW, you only hear one of these at a time, and when it moves off to the next one, the previous one stops. So since you can only hear one at a time, it'll stop the previous one and start the new one whenever you switch around to the next one. The other thing is that the game can reorder these in any sort of order. And the new sequence has to make sense when played back in the game. So the main idea here is They're horizontally laid out. That's where the word horizontal comes from, that they're laid out kind of back to back or end to end, and only one of the files is ever heard at any one time. So the entire stereo mix has to be contained within that file. So, horizontal resequencing. The games up to this point of 2D platformer and Angry Bots are in a have a horizontal music system, kind of a horizontal approach to playback of the music, meaning that you only hear one at a time, you only hear intros, then you only hear main loop, and then only hear endings. They don't overlap, they don't play at the same time. Same thing with ambient and action. You only hear one at a time. Every once in a while, you'll get a crossfade. That's a little bit more complex overall, but it still is basically going from one to the next. So here, these multiple different colored blocks represent different game states. Those game states, these are kind of like ambient and action. Maybe you have an intro game state that plays only when the game starts. The action cue represents most of the gameplay while the player is playing. Power up could be maybe you get a armor power up or a weapon power up, or you go into berserk mode for the next 20 seconds and you're invincible. Well, maybe you have a 20-second long one-shot piece of music. You know the power-up's only 20 seconds, so you only have to write a 20-second long phrase for that, and then it switches back to action. Again, you only hear one of these at a time, and they have the full stereo mix in each one. Low health, when you hit a certain health, when the game state switches and you hit a particular level of health, you only have 10% left maybe. You hear a low health piece of music, and then eventually if all of the health goes away, then you hear the death cue. And you can switch around these in any sort of order, and it always makes sense. So that's one of the challenges, is that whenever you reach the end of a particular piece of music, it has the possibility of jumping to any of the other pieces of music or looping back around to the front. So it basically is like a fork in the road, and you can choose any which path that you need to move through that piece of music. So it can be shuffled in any sort of order. Only one piece of music is heard at any time. A horizontal musical approach is better used when you know what the game is going to do, or generally what the player has to do to progress through the game. If your game is more linear, meaning that they start at point A and they have to work their way through from point A to point B, and then they get to point B and they have to go from B to C and C to D all the way to Z. If you know kind of the general path, or your game is set up in levels where they have to go from level 1 to 2 to 3, then a horizontal music system is a better approach. Horizontal music and this sort of horizontal approach to the music, where it's individual files playing only one at a time and they're being shuffled and resequenced around, goes back to the dawn of audio and music in games, where game systems could only play one file at a time. So you had to put the entire stereo mix in that file and then just shuffle between a whole bunch of them to get the correct effect that you wanted. So if it works a bit better in kind of simpler games where they have a much more linear approach to playback. So action games, puzzle games, casual games, kids games. Even though Tomb Raider looks great and it's very advanced in the gameplay and the graphics of it, the music is pretty much in a linear format, meaning that you only hear this piece of music when you exist in this area, and you have to get from here over play through this particular part to get to the next part of the game and just kind of move on. It becomes very kind of sequential, and you can get a pretty solid sense of how the music is going to play out. It's more like an interactive movie than directly a large open game. Uses multiple themes, each one of them fully mixed. Each theme replaces the one before. So it can rearrange in any different order, in any different sequence to create the final effect. Compare that against a vertically layered composition. Now, instead of thinking about a single stereo track in your DAW, think about multiple tracks. And in this case, instead of being horizontally laid out in front of each other, side to side, they are vertically stacked on top of each other. This is often known as a parallel music system because they're being played at the same time. They're being played in parallel. So a vertical music system will have music that is, this is more of the approach of our Palace of Renthalion game this week, where you have multiple files all playing at the same time. They start at the same time, they end at the same time, they're going to loop all together, and this allows you to fade up and fade down any particular level whenever you need it. So you can introduce a new musical idea as soon as you need it, because when it plays with the other pieces of music, it always makes sense. Because it's just like a multi-track DAW session. If you've got drums and bass and guitars and horns and keys, well, it doesn't matter when you fade in any of the different elements because they're all in the same key. They're all in the same tempo. It's all part of a much larger song. So they all are meant to be played together, and they're just being played parallel at the same time. And the vertically layered terminology comes from the fact that they're kind of stacked on top of each other. So uses one ongoing piece of music. It can typically be minutes long with multiple layers. Probably 3 to 6 layers is probably more common. Getting too many more than that gets difficult to keep them all in sync and get the combinations that you need, but it all depends on how advanced the music needs to be at that particular period of time. And it allows you to introduce new ideas, new elements of the mix to match the player's action much quicker. The problem with a horizontal music system is that you have to wait for the previous piece of music to either end or to be able to transition at a particular point in time. You have to wait for the rhythm of the music to make sense. But with a vertical system, you can bring something in even between the beats because it's playing in sync all the way from the beginning, and it will always make sense whenever you introduce new ideas. Fantasy and horror games use a vertical layering system very, very well. Fantasy games more towards like an open world type of game where it is where the player can go off in any sort of direction and you don't know what they're going to do or when they're going to encounter any particular thing. Stop that. If you have less of an idea of what's going to happen and when anything is going to happen, a vertical music system is a bit better approach because you can introduce the new idea as soon as you need to. Like, you don't know when the player is going to encounter that enemy, but when they do, the new piece of music needs to fade in. A vertically layered system will work very well for this. Horror games are all about building tension up and down, building it up and releasing it back down. So these are common game states for a horror game. Ambient, proximity, close, action, and cooldown. So ambient is where the player, whether they know it or not, they are safe at that point. Maybe they're still creeping around, scared from the previous encounter with the monster, but at this point they're safe. So there's this general bed of soundscape or music that is at the most safe point at this point. Proximity is now the enemy is out there. The monster's creeping around. Again, whether the player knows it or not, they are somewhere in proximity of the monsters. So now maybe some lower bass tones come in, maybe some dissonance to make it feel kind of uneasy. Close. This is at the peak of the tension, right? The monster's right around the corner. The player's probably trying to hide to get away from the monster. Hopefully the monster doesn't see it. Or maybe it does, and the player's unaware, and it's right about to jump out. So the music builds to this horrible peak of tension and intensity, and it's right about to break. And then the monster jumps out and attacks the player. Then you go into the action cue. Then now we've got the full on, all of the instrumentation, all the drums are pounding away. You've got the full pace, all of the instrumentation, everything is kind of pounding away at its full level. Then you have a cooldown state. Maybe the player gets away from the monster, runs and hides, or maybe they defeat the monster at that point. And so you can't just drop back down to ambient immediately. You have to kind of breathe a little bit and calm yourself back down. So there's a cooldown stage where it basically goes through the levels in reverse and moves back towards the ambient, just so it can start that whole process all over again. So it's all about building it up and then releasing the tension back down through the music and the instrumentation. Utilizes one ongoing loop. Each loop layer must work with all of the other layers. This is really where more challenge for the composer lies in this composition, where you need to make sure with each new idea and each new instrument you add that it works with all of the other ones. It stays in the same key, the same tempo, same time signature to make it all fit together. That's why when working on with the Palace composition, a top-down approach is the best way of going here. I'll go back to the previous slides, but a top-down approach is considering the full composition first and then working down into its individual layers. So start with the chord progression first, start with the main composition. Typically starting with a piano is a good place to begin with, because it is just kind of a blank slate, and it occupies lots of the registers. It occupies the lows, the mids, the highs, and it gives you a good range to work with. Figure out your chord progression first. Write a series of melodies. You know that each one of the cues requires its own melody. So that melody, the melodies each have to work against each other and the original chord progression. So writing out the parts on the piano focuses on the composition first, and then you can deal with the orchestration and figuring out which instruments play against, which instruments take the different notes. You can take certain elements and pull the different voices of the chords, the first, thirds, fifths, and sevenths, and pull those into different ranges, and have the cellos take the first and the third notes, and have the violas take the thirds and the fifths, and the violins take do the lead melodic line, and start building out your overall composition. Different approaches for vertical layering, whether there's additive and interchange, different ideas and of ways of thinking of this approach. Additive is building up one layer at a time and then coming back down through those layers, meaning that you always hear one and then you only hear two on top of one. And then it goes, 3 is only played with 1 and 2, and 4 is only played with 1 and 2 and 3, 5 only played with 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it goes up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and comes back down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You always hear the previous cues with the new layers. So you are adding a new layer on top each time. Interchange does not rely on any of the previous files to play. You can play them all in any sort of combination. So you can have 1, 3, and 5, and 2, 4, and 5, and any of the different combinations. You actually get more variations this way because you're not always reliant on the same combination of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And this interchange is how our palace composition works. You are not always hearing any one particular bed or any one particular loop. You are hearing any sort of combination that the player builds by turning on and off the different pieces of music. All right. I think that gets us through our topics for this evening. Some of the approaches of how the music is actually working in the game, using game states to be able to trigger the music and have it change at the correct period of time. Next week, we will get into the technology of audio middleware and game engines, and talk about how those work together to actually play the files, and how the game is actually built. So I'm going to stick around for a few minutes after our session today, and we can, if you have any questions, we can ask those and I can address those. But other than that, have a good weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday. We got our first question here. Jason, what are some of the common time signatures besides 4/4 that would work for the game composition this week? 6/8 or 3/4 would be quite a good place to be, especially in this kind of heroic sort of feel. So it would be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, dun 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 bum 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 bum. That works quite well versus 1, 2, 3, 4, dun dun dun. Kind of 4/4 would be more of a marching kind of feel, but 3/4 of a 6/8 could be more of a waltz kind of feel for that sort of Renaissance era kind of thought. Yeah, I was thinking 6/8. Yeah, I was thinking 3/4. All right, exactly. So head in those directions. Those would probably be best, because if you started getting into 7/8 or well, I guess 6/4 could kind of work for a march, but if you start getting into too off time signatures, then you start getting into more jazzy kind of feels that were not even invented in that time. So, but yeah, that's a good direction to head. I think there was a comment up here about the minor key. Minor key would probably work best for a lot of this, because you can really get danger and action really easily out of minor keys. You can even get emotion pretty easy overall, and then the heroic kind of feel, you can either go for the relative major or even keep it minor and still get some strong heroic lines. Is there a particular chord progression or progressions we could play around with? Well, I would kind of leave that more up to you in the kind of exploration of your composition. Starting on the tonic is probably a good place to be, because in that loop you could always have a nice place to return back to. But I could tell you I would maybe avoid 1/4/5 all the time, and 1/6/4/5, those kind of things. But it kind of work out a little bit further in larger chord progressions, but exploring the minor tonalities would probably be a solid place to go. Any modal scales that work well for this? I mean, you could explore kind of a Phrygian kind of feel. to give you new ideas of places to go. Um, but no, I mean, you're probably going, if you go too far into modal compositions here, then combining them together becomes a bit more difficult. So staying in kind of revolving around that minor Aeolian place is probably the best place to be. Is going up and down by thirds a good idea for an action vibe for the chord progression? Sure. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to come up with reasons why it wouldn't work. But you mean just moving up and down, like going a third up and then back down a third and up, or just moving, keep rising up by thirds through the scale? Could definitely be. Action, I feel more is about the pacing and the energy of the music. But I mean, going and using minor thirds in there is certainly a common place to be. Heard it used for a lot for that type of vibe. Absolutely. So, but yeah, those are all good ideas. Sounds like you have some solid places to start with overall. Um, I am working through the last couple of grade sheets I got the production technique and technical assignment back to you. Working on the last couple for the game composition. I want those to be done by this evening, and then have all of your revisions back to you tomorrow, so that we can move into the weekend to wrap everything up. So, all right, let's go ahead and wrap it up there. And I will see you again on Tuesday. Thanks.